Hi, this is Becky Spain, your instructor for business communication. Today we will be covering Chapter 9 in Excellence in Business Communication. This chapter is entitled Writing Negative Messages. Previously in Chapter 8, we looked at writing routine and positive messages, and today we're going to look at how to respond when the need is to write a negative message, sometimes referred to as a bad news message. Because the message is a negative message or a bad news message, it doesn't mean that you need to write it in a negative way. As a matter of fact, it should not be delivered in a negative way. By maintaining your focus on ethics and etiquette, by making sure that you're keeping your audience's needs in focus, bad news can be delivered in ways that are sensitive and professional while still being effective and achieving the results that you need to achieve. So let's begin by looking at learning objective number 1, which is applying the 3-step writing process to negative messages. So we're staying in line with what we've learned throughout all of our chapters with this 3-step process. You're going to plan your negative message, then you're going to write your negative message, and then you're going to complete your negative message. Communicating negative information, you can have up to 5 distinct goals. You need to, first of all, convey the bad news, and then second, you need to gain acceptance for the news that you're giving your reader or your audience. Third, you need to maintain as much goodwill as possible with your audience. Fourth, you need to maintain a good image for your organization. And then finally, you need to reduce further correspondence on the matter. Accomplishing all 5 goals requires careful attention to the 3 steps of planning, writing, and then, of course, completing your message. So let's begin by looking at the first step. Step number 1, planning your negative message. Planning negative messages, remember that your audience does not want to hear what you have to say. So to minimize the damage to business relationships and to encourage acceptance of your message, you need to plan carefully. With a clear purpose and your audience needs in mind, you need to gather information for your audience that they will need in order to understand and accept your message. We need to remember that negative messages can be intensely personal to the recipient, and in many cases, the recipients have a right to expect a thorough explanation of the news given. Next, you need to select the right combination of media and channels. This is actually a critical step. For instance, experts advise us that bad news for employees should always be delivered in person whenever possible. This would allow you to both show respect for your employees and also give them an opportunity to ask questions. Unfortunately, an increasing number of managers appear to be using emails and other electronic media to convey negative messages to employees. I'm sure you can guess why that is. It's sometimes uncomfortable for you as a manager to deliver a negative message to employees, especially if it has something to do with maybe like a job reassignment or even a reduction in workforce where you have to let people go. So it's a whole lot easier to carefully craft a letter or an email and send that out, but an absolutely cold thing to do for the employees receiving the negative news. So it's always important to remember that whenever possible to deliver negative news to employees face-to-face. Taking the extra time and care to do that will go a long way in helping you to keep that employee-employer relationship functioning in a way that's beneficial to both of you. And then finally, the organization of the negative message requires particular care. So a negative message can use either the direct approach or the indirect approach. You would use the direct approach. Maybe the bad news is expected or is not of critical nature. You would open with the bad news, then you would talk about the reasons for the situation and the decisions, and then you would end with a positive statement aimed at maintaining a good relationship with your audience. So in contrast, the indirect approach opens with the reasons behind the bad news before presenting the bad news itself. Following this decision tree in your book on page 254 can help you to decide whether the direct approach or the indirect approach is better for any given situation. To help you work through this approach and which is going to be better for you to use, the direct or indirect, you can ask yourself questions like, do I need to get the reader's attention immediately if the situation is an emergency, or if someone has ignored repeated messages that you've sent in the past? The direct approach can help you get attention quickly. You can also ask yourself, does the recipient prefer a direct style of communication? Some recipients prefer the direct approach no matter what. So if you know this about your audience, then go with the direct approach. You can ask also, how important is this news to the reader? If it's a minor situation or a routine scenario, the direct approach is almost always best. However, if your reader has an emotional investment in the situation, or the consequences to the reader are actually considerable, then your indirect approach is often better, particularly if your bad news that you're giving is unexpected. And then finally, ask yourself, will the bad news come as a shock? So the direct approach is fine for many business situations in which people understand the possibility of receiving bad news. However, if bad news might come as a shock to the reader, use the indirect approach to help them prepare for it. Let's move on to step 2, the writing the negative message. You need to write your message with clarity and sensitivity. You can actually take some of the sting out of the bad news and help your readers accept the decision and move on whenever you're just writing clearly, but also with sensitivity. If your credibility with the person that you're writing to hasn't yet been established, you may need to clarify your qualifications so the message, the recipients won't question your authority or your ability to make this decision that you're sharing with them. Make sure that you use language that conveys respect and avoids an accusing tone. This will help you to protect your audience's pride and their feelings. Though this type of communication etiquette is always important, it demands special care when you're writing a negative message. And finally, always look for the positive wording that you can put in a message to kind of help ease the sense of disappointment. Though depending on the situation, it might be difficult to do, but it can certainly help your reader. And then step 3 is completing your negative message. As always, review and revise your content to make sure that everything that you're saying is concise, it's clear to the reader, you've given a complete accounting of the facts, because even small flaws can be magnified in the reader's mind as they react to negative news. Make sure that your document or your email is visually looks professional and clean, and make sure that you don't have any mistakes in it. And then finally, be sure to deliver your message promptly. Actually withholding or delaying bad news that you knew about and just were hesitant to deliver can be unethical and, depending on the situation, sometimes even illegal. Moving on to learning objective number 2, explain how to use the direct approach effectively when conveying negative news. And just as a really quick review, a negative message a negative message that you organize using the direct approach. It starts with first the clear statement of the bad news. It then presents reasons for the decision, and then it ends with a positive statement aimed at maintaining a good relationship with the audience. Stating the bad news at the beginning can have 2 advantages. First, it can make a shorter message possible, and second, it can allow the audience to reach the main idea of the message in less time. So opening with a clear statement of bad news. If you've chosen the direct approach to convey the negative message or the bad news, you'll want to start with an introductory paragraph of your message to share that information. Avoid being overly blunt. You can use neutral or positive statements that will establish a common ground with the reader and then transition into the news. And if necessary, you can always remind the reader why you're writing. So no matter what the news is, just come right out and say it. Maintain a calm and professional tone that keeps the focus on the news and not on any personal factors of the people that you're writing to. So after opening with your clear statement, then next you want to provide reasons and additional information. So in most cases, follow the direct opening with an explanation of why the news is negative. How deep you go into your explanation will depend on the nature of the news that you're giving, as well as the nature of your relationship with the reader. If you encounter some situations in which explaining negative news is neither appropriate nor helpful, such as when the reasons are confidential or excessively complicated or irrelevant to the reader, then just don't go there. Or you may want to explain why you can't provide that information. So let's talk about determining whether or not you want to apologize in your message. This is a question that has been debated for a long time, and in my opinion, it is starting to change. In the past, businesses have usually taken the hard line and have said, never apologize. It will open us up to lawsuits. It makes us look like we made a mistake. It shows weakness. But more recently, there's been a change of attitude toward that. Many organizations are viewing an apology as not necessarily an admission that they made a mistake, but rather an opportunity to identify with whoever they need to apologize to, or whatever the situation is that you're questioning whether you're going to apologize about. It gives you a chance to identify with them and help them to feel the empathy that you have with them for what they're going through. And as far as lawsuits go, we're finding that judges and juries and even plaintiffs tend to be more forgiving of companies that express sympathy to wronged parties, or to potentially wronged parties, or to parties that think they've been wronged. So an apology can actually go a long way to repair a company's reputation, and I personally think that it's a great way to show integrity and to help build credibility in today's environment. So after opening with a clear statement of the bad news and providing your reasons and additional information, of course, you want to close on a respectful note. If it's appropriate, you could even consider offering your reader an alternative solution if that's something that would be applicable in that situation. And if doing so would be a good use of your time and your relationship with that person. Look for opportunities to, of course, include positive statements, even though you're giving bad news, but avoid creating false hopes. All right, and moving on to learning objective number 3, explain how to use the indirect approach effectively when conveying bad news. So the indirect approach helps your reader prepare for the bad news by outlining the reasons for the situation before presenting the bad news itself. However, the indirect approach is not meant to obscure the bad news, it's not meant to delay it or even limit your responsibility in the bad news. The purpose of this approach is to ease the impact of the bad news and help your reader accept it as you're rolling out the information. When done poorly, the indirect approach can be very disrespectful and sometimes even unethical, but when it's done well, it's a good example of writing a message that's you-oriented to communicate information to the person that you're trying to communicate it to. So you want to begin with a buffer. A buffer is defined as a neutral, non-controversial statement that establishes common ground with your reader. So depending on the circumstances, a good buffer can express your appreciation for being considered. It can assure the reader of your attention to the request. It can indicate your understanding of the reader's needs. It can introduce the general subject matter or simply establish a good common ground with your reader. Be careful not to use a buffer as a means of avoiding the negative message or to suggest a positive outcome for the reader. Misleading the reader can be dangerous business, so always ensure that your buffer is respectful and relevant and isn't misleading, and it provides a smooth transition to the reasons that are going to follow in your message. So a good buffer needs to be honest and sincere. And in contrast, a poorly written buffer might trivialize the reader's concerns, divert attention from the problem, with like insincere flattery or irrelevant material, or mislead the reader into thinking your message actually contains good news. So there's a list of types of buffers in table 9.2 on page 258. So when you have a second, read through this list and it will help you to get some ideas on types of buffers that you can use. After opening with the buffer, you want to provide reasons and additional information. Choosing an effective buffer will serve as a transition to the body of your message, and it's in your body which you'll provide the explanations and the informations for your negative news. The ideal explanation section of what you're writing will actually lead your readers to the conclusion before they actually get there in reading your message. Can give reasons effectively by maintaining your focus on the issue at hand and diffusing the emotions that generally accompany significantly bad news. When providing reasons, start with the most positive points and then move forward to your increasingly negative points. Be concise, but provide enough detail for the reader to understand the reasons. You have to remember that even valid and well thought out reasons won't convince every reader in every situation. However, it's a good amount, with a good amount of planning and preparation, you'll know that you have done everything possible to prepare the reader for the main idea, which is the negative news itself. So you've opened with the buffer, and then you've provided reasons provided reasons and additional information, and then you are going to continue with a clear statement of the bad news. So after reasoning has been thoughtfully and logically established, your reader is prepared to receive the bad news. So state the negative news clearly and then make a smooth transition to any positive news that might balance the story. You can use 3 techniques to convey the negative information as clearly and kindly as possible. First, you want to de-emphasize the bad news. You can do this by minimizing the space and time devoted to the bad news. Second, you can present the bad news in the middle of the sentence because that's the point of least emphasis. And finally, you can embed bad news in the middle of a paragraph if possible. But one tip that I will give you here is you need to keep in mind that it's actually possible to abuse de-emphasis. So make sure that you state the bad news clearly, then transition to any positive news that might balance the story. The second tip is to use a conditional statement such as if or when. This implies that the audience could have received or might someday receive a favorable answer. And an example from the book would be a statement such as, when you have more managerial experience, you're welcome to reapply. So by saying such a statement, you could actually motivate applicants to improve their qualifications. And then the third is to emphasize what you can do or have done rather than what you cannot do. And we've talked about that before, but by focusing on the positive and implying the bad news, you can make the impact less personal and you can soften the blow. Now that you have made your clear statement of bad news, you want to close on a respectful note. Your conclusion is an opportunity for you to emphasize your respect for your audience, even though you've just delivered unpleasant news. A positive close will help you to build goodwill. It can offer suggestions for action. It can provide a look toward the future and make sure that whatever you say is always sincere. Whatever type of conclusion you use, you need to make sure that you avoid any uncertain conclusions. So if the situation or decision is final, avoid statements such as saying, well, I trust our decision is satisfactory, because that can imply that the matter is open to further negotiations or further discussions. So be careful not to open that door. You want to limit further correspondence. So be sure to only encourage additional communication if you're willing to discuss the situation further. You want to express optimism if the situation, if it would be appropriate to that situation. And finally, be sincere. Make sure that you steer clear of cliches that are insincere in the view of bad news. If you can't help, don't say, if we could be of any further help, because you can't help. So be careful to not state things like that. And once again, that kind of loops back to limiting future correspondence. Don't say things that encourages people to continue to, talk about this situation. Keep in mind that the close is the last thing the audience members have to remember you by. So even though they're disappointed, you need to leave them with the impression that they were treated with respect. All right. Which leads us right to learning objective number 4. Explain the importance of maintaining high standards of ethics and etiquette when delivering negative messages. So all business messages demand attention to ethics and etiquette, of course, but these considerations take on a special importance when you're delivering bad news to your audience, and that is true for several reasons. And the first is that there's a variety of laws and regulations that dictate content and delivery of many business messages. We also want to remember that negative messages can have a significant negative impact on the lives of those receiving them. So even if the news is conveyed legally, good ethical practice demands that these situations be approached with due care and sensitivity. And then third, remember that when delivering bad news, oftentimes emotions are running high for both the sender and for the receiver, and senders need to manage their own emotions and consider the emotional state of their audiences. Learning objective number 5. Describe successful strategies for sending negative messages on routine business matters. So professionals and companies receive a wide variety of requests and cannot respond positively to every single one, of course. So sometimes mistakes are made, or there are circumstances that just were not foreseeable, and this can lead to delays and other minor problems that occur just in the course of day-to-day business. So there'll be times when companies have to send out negative messages to suppliers or other parties that they do business with. So whatever the purpose, crafting routine negative responses and messages quickly and graciously is an important skill for every business person to learn. So let's begin by looking at making unexpected negative announcements. Many negative announcements are written in response to requests for an internal or external correspondent, but on occasion, managers will need to make unexpected announcements that are of a negative nature. Because these messages are unexpected, the indirect approach is usually the best choice. So open with a buffer that establishes some mutual ground between you and the reader, and then advance to your reasoning, announce the change, and then the last step, close with as much positive information and sentiment as is appropriate under the circumstances for which you're writing. Sometimes as a manager, you're going to receive a variety of suggestions and proposals, and some of them you've solicited and some of them are unsolicited. Sometimes they're from internal resources and sometimes they're from external sources. If you receive a proposal that was unsolicited, you may not need to respond at all. However, if you need to reject a proposal that was solicited, you owe the sender an explanation. And because the news will be unexpected, the direct approach is better. So in general, the closer your working relationship, the more thoughtful and complete you need to be in your response to that person. For example, if you're rejecting a proposal from an employee, explain your reasons fully and make sure that the employee can understand why the proposal was not accepted so that you don't damage your working relationship. Refusing routine requests. So saying no, unfortunately, is a routine part of business and shouldn't reflect negatively on you. The direct approach will work best for most of your routine negative messages. Your audience gets the answer quicker and it'll save you time in the long run. The indirect approach works best if the stakes are high. If you or your company have established relationships with the person making the request and you are forced to deny a request that you may have granted under different circumstances or in the past. So consider these tips as you develop your routine negative messages. Make sure that you manage your time carefully. Focus your limited time on the most important relationships and requests. Craft quick, standard responses for less important situations. So just make sure that you're allotting your time based on how important the response is to your business situation. If the matter is closed, do not imply that it is still open. So if the answer is truly no, then avoid phrases that might let your reader think that there's a chance of asking for this again. Offer alternative ideas if there are alternatives available, and then don't imply that any other assistance or information might be available if it's not. Handling bad news about transactions is always unwelcome and usually is also unexpected. So these messages have the goals of modifying the customer's expectations regarding the transaction, and then explaining how you plan to resolve the situation, and then finally making sure that you repair whatever damage might have been done to the business relationship. So make sure that the content of your message and the tone of your message addresses the specific situation. It can vary widely depending on the nature of the transaction and the nature of your relationship with the customer. If you have not done anything specific to set the customer's expectations, such as making a promise that you're going to deliver within like 24 hours, the message simply needs to inform the customer with little or no emphasis on an apology. But if you did make a commitment and you're unable to meet that, then your task, of course, is more complex. So in addition to resetting your customer's expectations and explaining how you'll resolve the problem, some messages also need to include some element of an apology. Your book has a really great example on transitions for negative messages in Figure 9.4 on page 264. So take a look at that whenever you get a second. This message is a combination of both good and bad news, and it uses the indirect approach, with the good news serving as the buffer for the bad news. So in this case, the customer wasn't promised delivery by a certain date, so the writer simply informs the customer when to expect the rest of the order. The writer also takes steps to repair the relationship and encourage future business with them. There will be times as a manager when you are going to have to refuse a claim or a request for an adjustment. And the thing that you need to remember is that almost always your customer is going to be emotionally involved in this. So take your indirect approach. That's going to be the best one for your refusal. Your job as a writer is to avoid accepting responsibility for the unfortunate situation and yet avoid blaming or accusing the customer. So pay special attention to the tone of your message and avoid language that might have a negative impact on your reader. Instead, demonstrate that you understand and that you've considered the complaint, and then rationally explain why you're refusing the request. And then close on a respectful note. Moving on to learning objective number 6, lists the important points to consider when conveying negative organizational news. So as a manager or even as a business owner, you might need to issue negative announcements regarding some aspects of your services, your operations, the products that you offer. These messages include news of significant changes that negatively affect one or more groups of people. Announcements of workforce reductions. I hope that it doesn't, but unfortunately in today's world, there's a good chance that at some point you will be involved in a workforce reduction, and then also for crisis communication. So looking at the guidelines for negative announcements, negative situations will test your skills as a communicator and as a leader. When you have to make a negative announcement, make sure that you match your approach to the situation. So for an example, in an emergency situation, such as when a product has been tampered with or there's been a spill that could be toxic, get to the point immediately. Don't beat around the bush. Just come right out and say what it is. You also need to consider the unique needs of each of the groups that are affected by your message, such as even when a facility closes or downsizes, employees need to find new jobs, and community leaders may need to be prepared to help people who have lost their jobs. Oftentimes there's a financial impact to even just the vendors that are in that community. So all of these need to be considered. You need to minimize the elements of surprise whenever possible. So give affected groups as much time as possible to prepare and to respond. And then if possible, give yourself enough time to plan and manage a response. So make sure you're ready with answers to expected questions. Continuing on with our guidelines for negative announcements, look for a positive angle, but avoid giving false optimism or false hopes. So if you're laying off a bunch of people, don't give them an opportunity to explore new horizons. That's really a traumatic event, and it affects people and their families, their community, the economy in the community, and it can have an impact even for years. So the best you may be able to do is just to thank people for their past support and then wish them well in the future. But make sure, especially for a critical message like that, that you take under advisement with those peers that can work with you to make sure that you're crafting the best message possible. And you may even need to seek expert advice in the situation. There'll also be times when you need to use multiple channels to reach out to an effective audience, so you need to consider what's the best way to do that. And then finally, make sure that you're being open and transparent. Finally, learning objective number 7, describe successful strategies for sending negative employee-related messages. As a manager, you're going to have to convey bad news about individual employees from time to time. You can use the direct approach when writing to job applicants or sending a negative reference to a prospective employer, but it's best to use the indirect approach when giving negative performance reviews to employees themselves. And the main reason for this is that they are most certainly going to be emotionally involved in any negative feedback that you give to them. So in addition, also choose the media for these messages with care. Your written messages can let you control the message and avoid personal confrontations, but one-on-one conversations are more sensitive and promote the situation that would help give people an opportunity to discuss solutions together. So let's begin by looking at requests for recommendations and having to refuse those. You may get a request for recommendation from other employers or for past employees or current employees, and if you have to send a refusal, your message may be brief and direct. And I know we talked about this before, but make sure that you check first with your company to find out what the company's policy is on this, because once again, it may be that as part of the policy, you're required to simply state the dates that that person is or was employed with you, and sometimes whether or not they're rehirable, and that may be all that you can say in the matter. So make sure you know what your company policy is. Refusing social networking recommendation requests. So making recommendations in social networking environment is a little bit more complicated than with a traditional recommendation letter, because the endorsements you give will become part of your online profile, such as with LinkedIn. So fortunately, social networks give you a bit more flexibility when it comes to responding to these requests, because one option, of course, is to simply ignore the request or to delete the request. And then another option is to refrain from making recommendations at all and just letting people know that that's a personal policy for you whenever they ask. If you choose to make recommendations and you want to respond to the request, you can write as much or as little information about the person as you're comfortable with sharing. Just whatever you decide, remember that first of all that it's your choice, unless of course you have a company policy on this, and that may very well be the case. So once again, whenever you are even in social networking environments such as in LinkedIn, sometimes companies do control what they want you to do in those environments, and you need to make sure that you're up to speed on what your company is has written as in regards to policies concerning this. Rejecting job applicants. So another rejection of routine communication is rejecting job applications, and these are not always easy to write because recipients are, of course, emotionally invested in the decision that you've made. And then, of course, you also have to be concerned about what you write in regards to discrimination lawsuits, which there's been a recent rise in over the most recent years. So rejections must be written in a way that doesn't suggest any hint of discrimination. So the safest strategy is probably a minimal approach, which just basically starts by personalizing the message by using the recipient's name, then open with a courteous expression of goodwill, convey the negative news politely and concisely. Don't state or imply that the application will be reviewed at a later date. You are opening a door to continue conversations if you do that. And then just close with positive wishes for the applicant's career success. And then let's look at giving negative performance reviews. So as a manager, chances are one of your responsibilities will be to give performance reviews on a regular basis. These are designed to clarify the job responsibilities for that employee and then give them performance feedback on how they're doing in meeting those job requirements. It also is an opportunity for you to establish a personal plan for what that employee needs to be doing and anything that they need to be correcting or focusing on in the future, usually 6 months or 1 year time. So performance reviews also help companies to set organizational standards and values, and then to document evidence of performance, including performance that is below what expectations are. And sometimes those are needed if you are managing somebody out, basically meaning that they're not doing a good job, and if they don't continue to meet standards of performance, then they're going to be asked to be removed from the company, or they're asked to leave or be removed from the company, and you'll need to have good documentation on that in case you end up in court or even for unemployment. So if you need to write a review that includes negative information, just a few quick points, and then we will come to a close for this chapter, is to document performance problems. This is critical that you take the time to do that. Evaluate all your employees consistently. Try to use the same criteria on all employees. It's really easy to think about the most recent good or negative thing that an employee did, and you're actually evaluating over a period of time of usually 3 months, 6 months, or a year. So try to be consistent in so that you're fair to all of your employees. Write in a calm and objective voice. Make sure that you focus on future opportunities for improvement, and then keep your job descriptions up to date. As the job evolves and changes over time, which is often a problem in businesses, is that the job changes but no one has updated the written job description. You need to make sure that whatever the job description is for the person that you are evaluating is current, and if not, make any updates to that job description. And one of those reasons, of course, goes back to any problems that might arise in regard to discrimination or to improvements that need to be made. And then finally, terminating employees and following up with giving negative performance reviews. There's going to be times as a manager that you are most likely going to have to terminate an employee for one reason or another. So once you've given an employee an opportunity to bring their performance up to company standards and that doesn't happen, or if there's a reduction in workforce, which is happening lots and lots more these days, A company often has no choice but to terminate employment with one or more employees. So as with other negative employment messages, remember that this situation is fraught with emotions as well as legal ramifications. So be careful in your planning and in your documentation. Termination messages should always be written with input from the company's legal staff. So make sure you run that by either your legal department or your human resource department. Just write clearly and present your reasons for your actions. Make sure that those reasons are presented in a way that cannot be misconstrued or be considered as being unfair or discriminatory. Make sure that you follow company policy. Avoid any personal attacks or insults of any kind. That's so critical. And of course, ask another manager to review your information or your letter before issuing it, and then deliver the termination letter or information in person if possible. So once again, today we're kind of ending on a downer note, and I hate that. But next time that we meet, we will be looking at Chapter 10, which is looking at writing persuasive messages. So kind of a fun chapter, and I look forward to talking to you more at that time.